today's meeting is all about the security usage of OpenChain ISO 5230. And we have Mark Giese, who's the head of the actual specification work team, to talk through the current status of where we're at with the security guidance documentation and where we're going next. Now, this is super important because a ton of companies are beginning to use OpenChain in security, and a ton of governments are beginning to talk about how OpenChain fits into security. Examples in the United States would be that NTIA is talking about how SPDX works in the context of the National Software Bill of Materials work, but also how OpenChain works as process management. We're having similar discussions in China and in Japan. We're having discussions open in Taiwan, India. So what we need to do is to give the world a nice bit of guidance on how OpenChain fits into security and what they can do. And to illustrate that, I'm going to hand over to our very own Mark Giese and turn off my screen sharing, which was showing our antitrust policy notice as usual, so he can do his screen sharing. Mark, thank you for coming online very late at night.
No problem. Hello, Shane and everyone. All right, let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, I do have some slides, very brief set. And then I have the document that we've been working on. So here's a very brief agenda. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the second point. I do want to highlight the fact that we kind of started an activity. So the activity that we started.
Fucking niggers.
I don't know, Shane, do you want to? Hello?
Zoom bombing?
I'm sorry, Mark. There was a Zoom bomber who I got rid of.
Okay, great. So first, we'll briefly talk about if there's any feedback on the current ISO spec, and then we'll briefly discuss about creating an engagement as the community engagement as a first optional extension. Although we're not going to spend a great deal of time today, I do want to highlight the fact that we kind of started that discussion, and I want to let people know we haven't forgotten about it. And then finally, I want to really jump into the details of the security reference guideline or guide. Okay. Briefly, is there anybody who has any feedback on the current ISO spec?
I have some generalized feedback from our friends in China. We've seen some really nice engagement from companies like Huawei recently. And it seems that the spec is being useful in the context of their market space, and are, for example, reference translations and so on are working well. So it looks like the current spec language is resilient for non-native speakers as expected.
Excellent. Okay. Any other feedback? Even possibly people have been working with it and they have some questions about it, or places we might want to consider improving it. Okay, I'll assume there's not much discussion there, but there's always an opportunity to communicate to the mailing list as well as to me directly if you want to remain anonymous with your feedback. Okay, moving on. We've been focused on the next phase of the spec is looking at how we might create kind of extensions to the spec. And these are the kinds of areas we've discussed. One of the areas within the spec is the community engagement section. We felt like that might be a great first piece to pull out of the spec without really breaking anybody's conformance to the spec, making it a separate, maybe more elaborate kind of section than we currently have. And then, of course, there's security, which has become a really big topic for a number of reasons, right? And so we've kind of been going almost like in parallel of looking at these two optional extensions to the spec. Now, when it comes to the community one, we thought this would be a good first actual way of extending the spec and the community version engagement part. But security would be more of a guidelines document, which would eventually become potentially an extensional option to the spec. We're a little concerned about people in, who are already conforming with it. We don't want to, scare them away because, some people are just very focused on license compliance. However, we believe by putting together a guidelines document and letting it sit out there and kind of get feedback on its own, that might give us a much better insight on how we might bring it in as an optional extension. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay.
Well, I just have a general question. When do you think we can go to market with the guidance document, realistically?
After today, I think we can make an assessment on that. I
Oh,
mean,
Mark, are you sharing your screen already? Because we don't see it right now.
oh, sorry about that. I was.
Just checking.
Hmm,
Thanks, Yari,
okay.
for a quick direct message question there.
Yeah, hold on again. I was halfway there. I went to
There
the
we
screen
go.
share. Yeah.
There
Okay.
we go.
Okay. So this is just a simple picture I like to put up every once in a while to explain to people that these are optional sections. And as I mentioned, community engagement is kind of a part of the spectrum. We're thinking of breaking it out and making it an optional piece. And then basically, I wanted to talk about these two pieces that's our focus at the moment. And Shane's asking about our ability to go to market with the current guidelines document that we have. What we did on the last mini summit was take the spec kind of as a starting document template. We edited it to customize it to be just very security focused instead of license compliance focused. And I'll go over what we have today. And at the end of today's meeting, we can make that available for other people to chew on. As far as going to market with it, again, I think at the end of this meeting, it'd probably be something we can do a quick assessment on. One thing I want us to also consider as we look at this guidelines or guide is that some questions we need to answer. Should, for example, we require that in order to satisfy the guidelines, should you be required to be OpenChain conformant? That means you have the license compliance piece, or should we have it as a recommendation that you be conforming? It's one thing we have to debate and decide on. The second consideration is, should we, right now, it's largely focused on what I would call security vulnerability, known security vulnerabilities. Okay, security has a very broad potential scope. But for now, when we're talking about security assurance, we're really focused on detecting in the open source that you're using known security vulnerabilities or CVEs. CVEs, if you're not familiar with that, are well identified vulnerabilities with which are given an ID, which then we all can communicate over. The third consideration is, should it only be on the open source part of a software solution? Now, it's natural within our scope of our mission to be all about open source, right? Like, for example, license compliance is about building trust around the use of open source by ensuring they're complying with licenses. I think right now, the idea is to say, all right, let's expand our mission to say trust around the open source with respect to security vulnerabilities. Naturally, though, the processes we cover when it comes to open source naturally apply to the other non-open source stuff in your solution, okay? One thing I like to always remind people is OpenChain is not about open source software. It's about any software solution that happens to include open source in it, which oftentimes is quite large, a large percentage. So for now, I'm assuming that we're looking at a software solution, just like we do license compliance, and someone's doing an inventory of the open source, and then we're going to focus on giving trust around security vulnerabilities with respect to the open source software only. Well, we can debate this. This is up for discussion, okay? Should that be the scope? Or should we be broader and say the whole software solution? And finally, should we be tackling what I call dynamic detection? That means everybody typically has a software development lifecycle. And you do, right before you ship, you'll have some process you go through, you'll scan possibly and detect known security vulnerabilities right before you ship. Okay, product ships, but we know that things are discovered after your product, leaves the company, goes out in the world, and all of a sudden now you have known vulnerabilities are determined, and then you have to have a process in place where potentially you have to say, all right, not only am I verifying that the product we're about to ship is okay or has known vulnerabilities, but what happens when something's discovered after the fact? Should we be tackling that? Now, I'll pause briefly for this, and we'll come back to these questions, I think, after we go through the current draft. If people have any quick ideas or thoughts on these items, I'd like to hear them. And again, these are going to be up for discussion over the course of several weeks. Any thoughts here? Anybody see anything that particularly they have concerns over?
I think it's a good point. Does it require conformance or not? It would be fantastic if people could find the documentation useful, even if they're not conformant. So naturally, our preference would be conformance.
Okay. And I think the one thing we did leave last time when in the mini summit was we had it as it's recommended right now that you're OpenChain conforming. Yeah. Okay. And we'll get to that. Okay. Any other thoughts about whether we should broaden our scope beyond security vulnerabilities, CVEs? I think right now it's probably good to probably keep it very tight, focused, and then over time think about expanding it. Okay. And for now, we'll only be about the open source because that's our mission, to build trust in the open source that's used in any software solution. Okay. And I suspect we'll probably will be tackling dynamic detection. Okay. So let me go ahead and bring up the current draft. Here it is. Okay. So if you're familiar with our current spec, I just took the current spec and started editing it to be very security centric. And the term we're using is security assurance reference guide. And this is the 0.1. Okay. And what we did was you can see the table of contents looks very similar to the current spec. We obviously changed certain things, like we removed the word license compliance. So let's not worry about the intro. That's something can be done at the end. But the scope, again, is largely talking about security assurance program within a given organization. Then we're going to have definitions. Okay. A natural definition we're going to want to potentially include is a CVE. What is that, right? I mean, some of these others were borrowed from the spec because ultimately it's about a program. Do you have a program in place? Now, this should be about an organization's security assurance activities. Okay. And the participants, again, very similar. Exactly who are those that are involved? And then I figured we have to have a definition for security assurance. Okay, and then I left in SPDX because SPDX is taking on this broader role of being more of a software bill of materials kind of format, not just license compliance. And then these are some other simple definitions. So that's what we've kept so far. Of course, we need to include additional definitions as we go.
Shane?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what is, sorry, there's not Shane, but there's something missing on the document right now, because since the last month I've been reading a lot about people talking how actually the interoperability format there's SPDX is the end of the goal, but in the middle, and actually what is the common standard interchange format? And I don't know why, but suddenly the Sarif format starts to become some kind of talking everywhere. It's like everyone is starting to use the standard format for Sarif. So maybe you should include this in the document as well. It's like, and we need a common interchange format for everything. It's not only the end goal and the goal. So people ask it, what is happening in the middle? Because several things are working together in the middle. Yeah.
So I think you're touching on um, the sharing of a software bomb between organizations, right?
Yeah, but it's not only the software bomb. I'm talking about even the to reach the bomb, you need to pass through several stages for more than one tooling. Yeah. So in the middle of the stages, not the software bond itself yet, will be the software bond in the end.
That's right.
That will be the SPDX. But then if you're looking for in the middle of this things, how actually the tools are talking itself, then we are left this open. And there this is we need at least mention that we need to have a common interchangeable format. Doesn't mean that that would be this one or that one, but
I think we should keep that, on our list of things for consideration. Here's
yeah.
my concern: is one thing we want to try to do, like we do with the spec, is not be too prescriptive. We say, like, in other words, so if we believe that there's a need for a standard interchange format and everybody must do it that way, and there's only one way of doing it, right? It's what all quality programs will do. Then we should include it in the spec, or at least this guide.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
so, but let's just see how it goes. And if you can find a place where you believe there's just no other alternative but to use in that exchange format in the way we describe this, then we should seriously consider including it. But for now, I'm always reluctant, and this is my general reaction to anything, is not to put something in if it has a potential to be prescriptive, meaning some might want to do it that way, but others may not have to do it that way. Let's see if that becomes the case, that it's actually a mandatory thing that you can't avoid. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So what we have, just like with the spec, we have requirements. Okay. And the first requirement I have is it's actually not even a requirement. It's kind of weak this way. It says it is recommended that you are OpenChain ISO 5230 conforming. Okay. This is something we briefly discussed in the beginning of today's meeting. Right now, we're going to keep it as a recommendation. It is possible that we might say, in order to meet this guide, you might want to say you must be OpenChain conforming, because in order to use open source, it's table stakes. You got to basically conform with licensing. Otherwise, you don't even have the right to distribute your own product, theoretically, right? However, for now, because this is a guide and we're still working through this, we'll keep it as a recommendation. Okay. Then naturally, we're going to want to have, with the security assurance guide, we're going to want to have a policy. And this doesn't change. It's very similar to the spec. You're going to want some level of competence where you have training around security vulnerability stuff. And again, we keep it very general, so we're not too prescriptive. I'm going to move quickly through these sections to show people where we're at. The organization, you have awareness. So you have to be aware about the policy and other aspects around security assurance. It talks about the scope. This is where you have to define how far your program goes. Like, are you really focused just on one department within that organization, or is it the entire organization? Okay. Similar to the spec that makes sense here, we're always talking about a program. In this case, it happens to be a security assurance program. Okay. Moving on, here's where we kind of believe that you have to have some basic standard practices implemented. Okay, this might be one place where we might consider an exchange format. I'm not sure yet, but for example, we believe it is absolutely necessary for every organization to have some more organizational knowledge around CVEs. And again, if you're not familiar with the CVEs, these are standard. A database is maintained of these identified problems or known issues or vulnerabilities with IDs. There's an understanding that you should have some method for detecting these CVEs. We don't dictate what method you should use. We don't even, I think, suggest you should do scanning, although that's probably the most common thing to do, is to scan software looking for these things. We will expect that you have a way of following up on the CVEs when you find them, and we assume that you have a way of communicating them to the customer base when warranted. Not everything has to be communicated to the customer base, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about a systematic process that we'll go through where we'll require a score to be given out so that you'll make an assessment whether to, what action to take, what kind of risk. And then finally, is there a method for analyzing post-distribution? This is still to be debated. So these are standard practices. In the OpenChain spec, what we had here was you had some expertise around license obligations. That's what we had. In place of that, we're using these common practices we expect to be in place. Let me pause for a second here and ask, is there any of these, or do people believe that any one of these is potentially should not be a requirement or an expectation? And also, is there something missing that you think everybody absolutely should be doing? So let me start with the first one. Is there anything here you believe is too burdensome to assume everybody must have? Okay, I'll assume the silence is no one's really feeling troubled by this list. The question also is there any additional things we should include that we must have? Now, for example, it was brought up, you must be able to handle an exchange format. I'm not sure yet that should be here, but that would be a potential consideration. Okay. So these are, moving on, this is very similar to the spec. The guideline document assumes you have some ability to have access. And this means allowing the public be able to reach out to you and to contact you about concerns that they have around vulnerability inquiries. And similarly, you have to effectively resource your program, right? And so here, it's largely about having technical expertise pertaining to security vulnerabilities is accessible to those. In the regular spec, we have here, you have legal counsel or legal expertise that you had to make sure that there was some kind of access to legal expertise. Here, I use the word technical expertise pertaining to security vulnerabilities should someone come up with some question. Okay. So effective resourcing, again, pretty standard stuff. I don't get bogged down. We can always wordsmith this and clean it up, but this is the basic flow of the document. Next, this is borrowed completely 100% from the spec, only in that we assume that's common to all these optional things is that someone has a bill of materials. And that means you have an inventory of all the open source. All right, so and so this is not surprising section here. It just simply means because we're not guaranteeing that they're conforming to the spec. We don't know if they're not conforming to the spec. As a minimum, they should have a bill of materials as part of this guide. Okay. Now, here's where I would say the real meat of this document lives. Okay. Actually, the systematic steps for conducting the program or the core aspects of the program. What we used to have here is how you would go about systematically determining license compliance, right? Well, these were some of the things that I've identified. Well, I shouldn't say through the discussion at the mini summit, based on hearing all the feedback, this is how I summarized what we discussed. So for each open source component in the bill of materials, remember we assume that exists from the previous requirement. We apply a method for detecting the existence of known vulnerabilities, right? For each identified known vulnerability. Now, I use the word known a lot, and that's intentional because these are things that are well-defined and identified as CVEs, right? We're not talking about stuff that you happen to have your own internal list on, because that's a little harder to quantify because it doesn't have a unique identifier. But anyway, we can discuss whether we should broaden the scope or whether this is sufficient. But for each identified known security vulnerability, you assign some kind of risk impact score, so that whatever method you prefer, but somehow you have a way of scoring these things, right? How severe they are. And depending on the risk impact score, right? Let me put a hyphen here, or here we go. You take the appropriate action. Sometimes you might have to contact customers. It depends. This is up to your own organization. We're not going to dictate when you should and should not. You shouldn't necessarily do it for every single thing you identify. And then finally, if you had previously distributed software solutions, depending on the risk impact score, you have to determine what steps to take, including potentially. So again, this is the dynamic question. Do we support, right now, I assume we're going to support the notion of dynamic detection. You have a way of, after a product ships, being able to identify stuff. Okay, let me pause right here. Is there, first of all, is there anything that's not clear here about the steps? Okay. Do people think this is representative? Is it necessary and sufficient? Necessary means, is there anything that's, is there anything, anything that's not needed, or, and then sufficient is, do we have everything we possibly would expect? Can people still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I think it works personally.
Okay, and again, this is, we're going to iterate this over the next couple of weeks and maybe month, but I think this is a stake in the ground, right? We put a stake in the ground and let people come back and say, no, wait, whoa, 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 what about this? What about that? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe we should emphasize that people should not be shy about jumping in with ideas and thoughts. There's nothing too small or too big to bring to the table right here. But it's important that we bring stuff to the table because this is going to happen. We're going to be editing this. We want feedback and so on.
Now I'll take this section out. I just wanted people to understand this is what we had in the spec previously.
Right.
Yeah. So let's just, if this is not, if this is, let's say, necessary and sufficient at the moment, the next thing that I'd like to just briefly discuss is we had this other section where we talked about, it was kind of like the output of the program. We call the compliance artifacts, right? It was what we created and what we delivered. However, I don't believe there's anything to create as the output of this other than, we can talk about the records you keep internally, but I don't necessarily believe there's anything we need to create and pass on to the customer. Now, you can say, well, you got to give out the bill of materials, but that's not a requirement at the moment. And there's a lot of sensitivity around that. And sometimes you want to make sure NDAs are in place, whatever. So I'm not sure we want to go there yet. It doesn't mean we can't have that added over time, but I couldn't think, based on all our discussions we've had, what would be a deliverable you should actually deliver alongside the software like we have a license compliance. Any thoughts?
I have a question on that. From your Wind River experience, have you ever had trouble in creating security assurance artifacts that are compatible with various customers? Is there any form that we should recommend, or do we just leave it the same as usual? This is a process point, you decide what's correct.
So we do have, as more of a value add feature, is dynamic reports. And that's really after the product ships. We have a special channel and way of articulating once we detect things, right? Reporting back to the customer.
Yeah.
That's more the dynamic one. So that's what we do, but that's more of a, I would call it a feature more than an obligation.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
So pretty much that's it. I mean, in a nutshell, right now I'm going to take out this section, but I think if we ever come back and people are saying, you know what, we should require, What we will do is I'll make sure that the people are creating artifacts within their company. I have to go read through this. I want to hear what people have to say. But when we have, like, for example, the verification materials here, we're going to make sure that they're creating certain artifacts within their company and storing them, right?
Mhm.
So that the ultimate goal here is to make sure that when someone tells you they're OpenChain security assurance conforming, you can trust that they're disciplined and they're doing good things around checking for defects, right? Security vulnerabilities. If you choose that you want to actually go in and audit them, right? And that happens from time to time. That's the value of this, because this is a contract on how to audit each other. You can go in and we'll have certain kinds of artifacts that you need to store internally, such as you maintain the bill of materials, you maintain a list of all the, CVs you detected, and then, and possibly their impact values or something like that. And then if you're audited, because that's just an extra step people take around trust, well, this will dictate what you should at least as a minimum have recorded internally, okay? Not for necessarily distribution. And it's up to you to disclose that information, whatever artifacts, or how maybe you just show them where you keep the artifacts, but you don't show them the details of the artifacts. It's up to you, but that would be under NDA.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Do you think we're at the stage where we can put this assurance guide draft out to the mailing list and, help everyone dive into it regardless of their time zone and have a look, maybe leave comments?
Sure. I think so. I do expect some people have allergic reaction naturally, put it when, I was hoping to get some, stir some conversation here, but I think it's the natural next step.
Yeah.
So what I'll have to do is I'll clean this up. I'll make it a goal by the end of this week. Shane, I'll pass it on and we can decide on how we want to make that next step.
Absolutely. Yari, I see you're unmuted. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just like starting to think what Mark was saying about the artifacts, etc. That you have some internal, let's say, documents. I don't know, should that, because this is, let's say, guide. I don't know, should there be, a guide in, section there that, you should have this and that, but it's an internal, discussion what kind of artifacts those will be.
Yeah, I think when we come down to, let's see, I think the bill of materials has it, right? That's what has you basically you have a documented procedure, and then you also have records, right? So here's an example of one where you expect them to create the bill of materials and then keep it recorded inside the company. I think that's a fair thing to require. Now, if we come over here, we can add additional things here, right? So what would be things that you think are reasonable that everybody should do that's not too prescriptive? That would be the question for this section here. I'll take a stab at it. They should probably have not only a bill of materials, but a list of all the security vulnerabilities they have identified through their process over time. Probably should have that archived. And now here's, I think, is a little bit of a stretch here when it recommends you should have a risk impact score. It's kind of common, like you have different severities, right? Very severe, I think even CVEs are given on a scale of 1 to 10, right? And you could just use that same scoring mechanism, or you can have your own. I think that's the key, though, is you should score them, because not all security vulnerabilities are equal. And I think you should probably record not only the vulnerability detected, but also the score you gave to it. And you should have some kind of document that says, for each of these scores, this is how you're going to respond to them. Again, it's up to you to decide that, but we would expect that you'd have some systematic method for consistently responding to these things.
Yes, because I'm just thinking that, there could be some like severe issue, but then in the way somebody's using the component, that's not the issue at all. So there should be some sort of record that, okay, there's this issue, but because we use the component and that way, it's like zero risk or whatever.
Right.
There's some sort of like record on that, so that if there's a audit, they can, show that.
So you're suggesting maybe the record, there's two things, there's a score and then the action that was taken based on the, all the assessment made, scores are just a number or what, some kind of ranking, but ultimately maybe what you're suggesting is they should have some quick summary of action taken. Is that what you're thinking? The actual action they chose to take?
That's kind of my thing, like thinking that, especially if there's audit coming, then it'd be easy to at least recommend that you keep some sort of record, like why this is still there, or how this risk has been handled.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, every company has their own freedom to decide that, but you would like to think that they're disciplined enough to at least have some kind of mechanism like that. This is what this is largely about. Are they disciplined, in detecting and following up?
Yeah.
And that's part of the trust factor we're trying to convey. So I think that would be reasonable. Okay, so yeah, and I'll make sure that we capture in the actual verification materials what exactly they will have to record. Again, it'll be pretty generically described, but we should have some things. So that the ultimate issue here is if you're going to claim that you're conforming with this guidelines, then if someone was to audit you and you allowed them to audit you, right, then you would actually be able to present the respective documents and evidence of you following the process or program you claim you have. Okay. So that's it. That's it in a nutshell. I think I'll just put it out there, and again, this is just the beginning of a process. It's not, it's not anywhere near, final. So.
But I think it's looking good. It's going to get that conversation rolling. We've got a lot of stuff there for people to dig their teeth into. So that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
This is Fukuchi. And I'm not expert in the area of security, but I just want to know the U.S. government declared the executive order of improving the nation's cybersecurity, and as you know, and so they required us sharing threat information and cyber incident reporting, and also the enhancing the SBOM. And so, what do you think about the relationship, your draft and the U.S. government, the cybersecurity order? What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The NTIA, which is the National Telecommunication Information Agency, I believe, I do attend their meetings, and there's a lot of discussion about, creating a standard SBOM format. But they do debate that whole issue about whether, what you should include in the SBOM and whether they should, make them public or not. There's no agreement right now. Now, I know there's the executive order, okay, but when it comes to that whole initiative, there's really no solid position on requiring an organization to give out their SBOM, right? Now, they are, there's a basic point made that, you probably should, as a minimum, be able to offer one up under NDA, right? But the other discussion was, well, you put your software out there, you give it to every single customer. Do you have to give them an SBOM, or even do you have to make it public on your website, which creates a lot of concerns for some companies because they're worried that by publishing the SBOM, they might expose to the hackers in the world what pieces they're using that might allow them to, it would focus their search on how to hack you, right? So some companies are very sensitive about just publicly putting out an SBOM. And I think that what would more likely happen is that you may choose to have to deliver one, but that's between you and the customer, and it might be done under NDA, right? So in that case, there's no, I guess, firm position from the NTIA's side of it on whether it's an absolute requirement to give the SBOM out.
Okay, so at present, there is no relationship with your proposal and the U.S. government executive order.
I wouldn't say this is definitely something that complements that order. It doesn't fully implement the order, right? We're here to, let's say, the first and foremost, what we're trying to do is build trust in the use of open source, right? And we've done it with license compliance, and now we want to do it with security, vulnerability management, right? And the executive order largely is around software and cybersecurity, and it's a little broader. We're focused on open source, but it turns out that many solutions in the world are, the lion's share is open source, right? And in some ways, open source is a little different beast. That's what everybody grabs. Everybody's grabbing open source, right? And so we want to make sure they're disciplined in when they grab it. And it's different actually when you write your own code. When you write your own code, there's less eyeballs looking over it, right? So security vulnerabilities are much more documented in the open source world. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we're not trying to solve the whole executive order problem, but what we're trying to do is solve the problem when it comes to open source, which happens to be the lion's share of a lot of software solutions.
Okay. And thank you for your comment, and I understand. Yeah.
But I think this is very strategic and very important for that mission, right? For that, the spirit of the executive order. Anybody else have additional thoughts about that? I don't know if they're following the executive order or the NTIA's effort.
No, nothing. I think it covers it from what I've seen.
Okay. One last chance. Any comments about anything we've covered here? Oh, let me go back just for the sake of circling back to that issue around the topics. I don't know, now that we talked about it briefly, does anybody have any additional thoughts about these items here? So right now, I think what we're talking about, we're making it recommended. The first one, should the guideline document require open chain conformance? And right now it's only recommended, and I think we're staying there for now. It is very narrowly focused, although this is where a lot of people spend their time, right? Security vulnerabilities, because security is a big topic, as I mentioned. And I want to be very myopic at the moment. That's our beachhead, just stay focused on that one. And does anybody believe after this discussion that our focus should only be on open source? Should be on the entire solution? I do think it's natural for us to start out in the open source, and I think there will be pressure for us to say, well, can I apply this guidelines to the other parts of my software solution, the things I write, or my company or my organization writes? And I think the answer is yes. We expect it to. And finally, yeah.
No, I just concur with that. I think that's a good way to approach it.
And I think we're going to definitely want to deal with the dynamic, because that's really where a lot of the activity happens, because you do the static analysis, this product ships. I think having a lot of discipline around, people want to know, it's a recall issue, right? The product's out there, and the challenge is not just, oh, there's a vulnerability, but am I impacted by that vulnerability? I know I use that piece of open source, but I may not compile in the piece that makes me vulnerable. And in fact, you might have OpenSSL, right? We know there was Heartbleed, and there was like one line of code that if you had that file in that line of code, you may be impacted, but why do a recall if you're not impacted, right? So I think this is going to be an important topic here, the last one, but it does take a little bit more sophistication. And so we might want to go slowly there. Okay. So that's what we have for this week. I think that based on
That's
Shance's recommendation, we'll go forward and we'll take what we have and throw it out there and let the the darts come flying.
Mark, thank you. This is fantastic. We are, because of your hard work, a long way along with this. And I do think that it's really getting to the stage where we can tell the community, okay, dive in, let's get this finished soon. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Mhm.
Brilliant. Mark, thank you so much. I know it's late. Please have a lovely night. Everyone in Europe, well, gosh, welcome, good morning. And everyone in Asia, thank you for joining late in the afternoon. That's it for this meeting. Looking forward to seeing you all in about 2 weeks for the next meeting. And of course, our next webinar happens in 7 days. Take care all, be well, stay safe.